talk to you about George and Robert Stephenson, the masons who invented the Intercity Railway. And this story begins with the puzzle of Stephenson's apron. In 2013 I visited Darlington Lodge, number 6158, and was interested to see that they had a Masonic apron on show, which was said to have belonged to George Stephenson. At that time I wasn't aware that George was a Freemason. In 1973, the Institute of Mechanical Engineers had published the collected letters of its founding president, George Stephenson. The IMechE held some of his letters and engineering drawings, but many others were across various archives. William Skeet, a fellow of the IMechE, vice president of the Stephenson Locomotive Society, a council member of the Transport Trust, and a fellow of King College, London, was commissioned to assemble and edit the letters of George Stephenson in order to publish them 150 years after the founding of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. The book contained many letters and reports of George's activities, which were published for the first time. Stephenson had long been one of my engineering heroes, and I bought a copy many years ago. After visiting Darlington, I remembered there is a passing comment towards the end of Skeet's book, which said that George Stephenson was interred with full Masonic honours on the 17th of August, 1848, in Holy Trinity Church, Chesterfield. His resting place under the altar is marked by a plain stone slab bearing only his initials and the time of his death. As only Freemasons are buried with full Masonic honours, this record, discovered by William Skeet in the IMechE archives, confirmed what I had been told in Darlington. But what was not in Skeet's book was where and when George had been made a Mason. I decided the best way to find out was to look where George was and what he was doing, and construct a timeline showing all his recorded activities. I soon found that he had encountered 3 important Freemasons while still a young man, and that set the direction of his later career. The first Freemason George met was Brother Richard Trevithick, a Cornish engineer who built a practical steam locomotive which was used to haul coal in South Wales. Trevithick then came to Newcastle with his mechanic John Steele to show off his travelling steam engine in Gateshead. George went to see it and invited Trevithick to visit him at his cottage near Killingworth. At that time, George was brakeman in charge of the steam-powered winding engine at the Dolly Pit at Black Calderton. When Trevithick was asked to build a steam engine for Wylam Colliery with the intention it would carry coal from the mine some 5 miles down to the dockside at Lymington, George spent some evenings talking to Trevithick, with young Robert later recalling how he sat on Trevithick's knee and listened to them talk about the possibility of steam haulage. Once finished, the locomotive worked well on a strongly built test track, but it weighed about 4.5 tons and proved to be heavy for the wooden rails of the Wylam Horse Tramway. It was not practical to build a stronger track at that time, and so the machine ended up being used as a stationary pumping engine for the rest of its working life. The second Freemason who played a role in George's early life was the Earl of Strathmore, who was one of the 3 landowners known as the Grand Allies, who owned most of the mining rights in the northeast of England. The other 2 allies were Lord Ravenscroft and Lord Warmcliffe. Brother Strathmore's role in the development of George's engineering career begins with a meeting he had with the 3rd Freemason who influenced George's development. This 3rd Mason was the son of Brother James Watt, who was also called James. In October 1801, James Watt Jr. visited the Newcastle area to meet with users of the Bolton and Watt steam engines. Watt Sr. was the inventor of one of the first practical low-pressure steam engines, and had set up a manufacturing business with fellow Freemason Matthew Bolton to produce steam-driven beam engines. James Watt Jr. was a Lewis, who had followed his father into the craft. These early atmospheric steam engines were used as pumping and winding engines. During the early period of the steam engine, there were not many engineers who fully understood how these engines worked and knew how to maintain them. David Ross, writing in the book George and Robert Stephenson, A Passion for Success, suggests that the purpose of Watt Jr.'s visit was to seek out information from Bolton and Watt's customers as to how successful they were in managing to run and maintain their engines. There were no official training programs, and it seemed to be a matter of luck if a few natural engineers emerged from the untutored ranks of engine wrights who would set up and run the engines at maximum efficiency. Ross suggested that Watt Jr. was fishing in the small pool of self-taught skilled men. The manager of the Westmore colliery had identified George as a potential engine wright, as steam engineers were called at that time. When Watt Jr. visited, George was happily married with a young son and a pregnant wife, and was attending night school 3 nights a week to learn how to read, write, and calculate. By 1804, he had developed an interest in using steam locomotives to haul coal, and had shared ideas with Richard Trevethick. His future was looking bright. He was earning extra money by cleaning and mending clocks, and had developed useful shoe-mending skills which earned him a local reputation as a good cobbler. Then disaster struck. First, his young daughter Fanny died, and 6 months later, in May 1806, his wife also died. George was left a widower and the lone parent of a young son. The next period in his life was very strange, because he suddenly decided to move to Montrose. For a reason which has never been explained, he decided to leave his young son in the care of his housekeeper and walk 200 miles to Montrose to look for work. Why Montrose? And why did he think he would find work there? Most of the modern biographies gloss over this period of George's life and suggest that he was so grief-stricken by the loss of his wife that he abandoned his son. The most recent biography, published in 2011 by Robert Jones, dismisses the whole episode, saying, "Left as sole provider, George sought work in Scotland, leaving Robert in the care of a local woman while he did a job in Montrose." George's first biographer, Samuel Smiles, put forward this idea of a trip being inspired by grief, but also hinted at a deeper motive. He says, while his grief was still fresh, he received an invitation from some gentleman concerned with a large spinning works near Montrose in Scotland to proceed hither and superintend the working of one of Boulton and Watt's engines. This comment raises more questions than it answers. Who were these gentlemen concerned in building large spinning works, and how did they know about the skills and sudden availability of an obscure steam engine operator from a small pit on the outskirts of Newcastle, some 200 miles away? W.O. Skeat in George Stephenson, the Engineer and His Letters, notes, in 1804, Stephenson moved to Westmore, Killingworth, as a brakeman in a pit belonging to the Grand Allies. This was the beginning of an important connection for him. But Skeat does not discuss the nature of this connection. However, a paper entitled George Stephenson and the 19th Century Engineering Networks by Carol Doherty, a postgraduate researcher at York University, gave me a clue. Her paper traces the interactions of a small group of engineers, including James Brindley and Thomas Telford, who collaborated and reviewed each other's work. They were superseded by a different group of men, led by George and Robert Stephenson, who were from a different region and class background, and they took over the development of Britain's infrastructure, particularly its steam railway network. The transfer of power and prestige between these two groups, which led to the creation of the profession of engineering, was played out by the formation of two professional institutions during this period. Doherty goes on to ask, how did this network function? She suggests, did Freemasonry provide a non-professional means of contact amongst engineers and between them and their clients? I thought it did, knowing that George had been a Freemason, and so I began to test the idea by looking at what happened at Montrose in the summer of 1806. Let's talk about the background story of Montrose. Montrose was well known for its cottage industries, making sailcloth, fine linen and cambric. In 1805, the quantity of linen manufactured by household workers was 198,375 yards per year. One of the town's leading flax-making merchants, Freemason John Ford, realised that if he built a factory to spin flax, using newly invented machinery driven by Boulton and Watt steam engines, then he could greatly increase productivity. He approached Brother James Watt, who designed the necessary engines and drive mechanisms. Building work on Ford's Mill was due to begin in 1805. By the summer of 1806, the steam engines and their associated equipment needed to be installed and commissioned, but Bolton and Watt didn't have any commissioning engineers to spare. They did, however, have many contacts with homegrown engine wrights through their professional and Masonic networks. Brother James Watt Jr. had visited the Grand Allies in 1801. An enquiry to Brother Lord Strathmore quickly informed him that a promising young man from Killingworth was available to travel, being recently widowed. I suspect Lord Strathmore recognised this as an opportunity to increase the experience and skill of his young engine wright, whilst retaining his long-term services, so he facilitated the deal. And the records show that the Grand Allies encouraged George to take a year's commissioning contract from Bolton and Watt to install 2 new engines at Ford's Mill. George was paid by Watt to install, set up, and adjust the 2 new steam engines. He had accommodation provided and was promised that his job back home at Killingworth would be kept open for his return, and that his house would be kept on for his son to live there, looked after by a housekeeper. The formal history of Montrose says the celebrated George Stephenson was about a 12-month in Montrose, superintending the erection of Ford's Mill. But at that time, George wasn't celebrated. He was an unknown, semi-literate, self-taught steam engine operator from a small coal mine in the little village of Killingworth on the outskirts of Newcastle. But whilst in Montrose, he demonstrated his inherent technical ability by adding a boxed-in sump to the boiler feed pipes of the engines, which increased the working life of the pump barrel and the leather seals on the cylinders by reducing the ingress of grit. Everything about George suggests he was quick-witted, observant, and intelligent. Just before his wife died, he had been seriously considering emigrating to America. His sister Anne had already relocated to the USA with her husband, and had reported how good life was in the States. He was also concerned that he was at risk of being called up into the army to fight against Napoleon. He grabbed at this offer to develop his technical skills, enhance his reputation, and earn him enough money to emigrate. But it is impossible to imagine that he didn't ask, "Why am I getting this offer? How does Mr. Ford know about me?" Lord Strathmore's connection with Freemasonry was no secret, and neither was James Watt's. George had previously hosted visits by Brother Richard Trevethick in his home, and Trevethick also made much of his Masonic connections by visiting local lodges where he was working. With the inspiration of the second degree's injunction to study the hidden mysteries of nature and science, combined with the fact Trevethick was trying to encourage the Grand Allies to invest in steam locomotive, George must have learned something about Freemasonry and its role in bringing engineers and clients together from Trevethick and the actions of Watt and Strathmore. The engines in Ford's Mill were built under the supervision of Brother James Watt Jr., and George was working on behalf of Bolton and Watt, so he was bound to meet and interact with Watt. James Watt also made no secret of being a Freemason. He was highly active in the Grand Lodge of England to encourage Masons to erect a statue to his father. If George was impressed with the ideals and engineering-friendly philosophy of Freemasonry, then perhaps he probably asked about the craft. If he did, then he would have quickly found out there was a newly founded Masonic lodge in Montrose which was desperately in need of candidates. This lodge was Incorporated Montrose Kilwinning No. 182. George Stephenson never spoke about his time in Montrose, and did not write any letters home while he was there. The Right Worshipful Master of the lodge during the time was in Montrose was John Milne. I have not, so far, found any written evidence of his membership, but this does not necessarily surprising, and doesn't preclude George joining that lodge. We need to look at the practice of undocumented initiation that was taking place in Scotland at this time. James Watt was initiated, but no record of the event was kept by the initiating lodge. The website of the Grand Lodge of Scotland explains why this was. During the 18th century, It was the responsibility of the lodge, not Grand Lodge, to issue each new member with a certificate proving that he was a Mason. The certificate issued to James Watt is extant, and it reads, "To all and sundry to whom these presents come greetings. Know ye that the most worshipful the Grand Master of Scotland and Grand Lodge aforesaid, having granted a charter constituting and erecting a lodge of free and accepted Masons in this place, under the style and title of the Glasgow Royal Arch Lodge. These are to certify that the bearer hereof, Brother James Watt, was admitted and received and entered apprentice, passed a fellowcraft, and raised a master, after having paid the usual dues according to the bylaws of the lodge, and has behaved himself as becometh. Given under our hands at Glasgow this 10th of June, A.M. 5763. Robert Dodson, Master, James Wright, Senior Warden, William Dick, Junior Warden." Why was the initiation of James Watt not recorded? Again, the website of the Grand Lodge of Scotland explains. When a man was initiated in a Scottish lodge during the 18th century, the individual's name and occasionally occupation was meant to be sent to Grand Lodge, where the details were recorded lodge by lodge, in registers in chronological order. Payment of 1 shilling was to accompany the sending of these details. The temptation not to send details to Grand Lodge is obvious. That there are numerous instances of lodges recording members which do not appear in the central Grand Lodge register is proof of that. This seems to have occurred when lodges were under financial pressure, but this merely had the effect of transferring financial problems to Grand Lodge. As a newly formed lodge, Incorporated Montrose Kilwinning was under financial pressure. There is evidence it was struggling to recruit enough new apprentices to build a ladder of succession. The founding senior warden, Robert Dempster, took the chair in 1794 and again in 1800, 1804 and 1808. He finally served a 5th term in the chair in 1812. This is not a pattern of mastership I would expect from a lodge with lots of new members, all paying initiation fees. Rather, it suggests that the lodge was struggling to establish itself. George had every intention of returning to England when the job at Ford's Mill was finished, so for a lodge which was short of money, there would be a strong temptation to overlook registering him with the Grand Lodge, and so save the cost of registration to support the struggling new lodge. As James Watt's certificate eventually turned up, perhaps one day George's might be found. I hope it is. George was fortunate to work for a benevolent employer. W.O. Skeet added to my knowledge of George's relationship with the Grand Allies. In George Stephenson, the engineer, in his letters, he says, "It was fortunate for Stephenson that he was employed by them, as they were increasingly impressed with his achievements, and allowed him considerable freedom to carry out other work so long as he kept their engines in good working order." When George returned to Killingworth at the age of 26 years, it is highly likely that he was now a brother Mason to Brother Lord Strathmore. He had gained the experience of installing and fine-tuning the 2 steam engines at Ford's Mill. They were running well, and the stamp duty returns show that the town's output of linen had more than doubled to 465,369 yards yearly. The town still acknowledges George's skill in optimising the steam engines and making the mill a success. For his part, George had £28 clear profit in his pocket, but if he had hoped to buy himself and his son tickets to move to America, then he was disappointed. On his return, he found that his father had been accidentally blinded by a steam blast, had been unable to work, and had fallen into debt. Once he had paid off his father's debts, George unfortunately won the call-up lottery and received his draft papers for service in the army. However, he was allowed to pay for a substitute, and he did manage to find a volunteer. But once he had cleared his father's £15 debt and paid the £6 bounty to his substitute, he had little money left. He took up his old job of brakeman at Killingworth and persuaded his younger unmarried sister Eleanor to move in as housekeeper and look after young Robert. A year or so later, the Grand Allies allowed George to set up in business in partnership with Robert Weatherburn and George Dodds to maintain other collieries' steam engines in the area. and they gave him a fixed-price contract to maintain their engines to help him set up. He was becoming established as a capable engine doctor, and he consolidated this position when he sorted out a Newcomb pumping engine that the Grand Allies had installed at Cullingworth High Pit, but which didn't work very well. The pump's failure left the pit flooded and unworkable. George sorted out its problems with the pumping engine, and within days the mine was dry enough to produce coal. His reputation as an expert on steam engines was now established. Lord Strathmore put him in charge of all the Grand Allies' mechanical equipment at a salary of £100 per annum, while still allowing him to take on other work. Now he could afford to send his son Robert to school. Robert later recollected that his father was very keen to see him well educated, as he had become convinced while away in Montrose that this would be the key to his success in life. All the colliery owners in the north-east were struggling to move their coal, as Napoleonic wars had reduced the domestic availability of draft horses and fodder. In 1813, Christopher Blackett, the owner of Wylam Colliery, asked engineer William Headley to build a travelling steam engine to see if it could haul coal more economically than using horses. Headley went on to build two successful locomotives, known as Puffing Billy and Wyland Dilly. George Stephenson took a great interest in them, and constructed a model steam locomotive to test his own ideas on how a travelling steam engine might work. In 1814, the Grand Allies asked George if he could build a steam locomotive for them, and he was up for the challenge. With the help of Nicholas Wood, the Killingworth colliery manager, George built his first travelling steam engine, which he named Blucher, after the famous general. To keep Blucher in line, George made a flanged wheel which held it in place against a raised rail. This system is still used today on all railways. Blucher could haul 30 tons of coal at 4 miles per hour up a slope of 1 in 450, and it could keep going all day without needing to rest. In 1814, at the age of 33, George had begun his career as a railway engineer, but that was not his first claim to fame. His first claim was the Geordie lamp. He'd been working in Felling Pit in 1812 when an underground explosion, caused by a lighted candle igniting a leak of fire damp, killed 90 men and boys. The following year a similar explosion killed a further 22 colliers. In his spare time, to relax from the hard work of steam locomotive construction, George decided to do something about this dreadful hazard. He'd noticed that when a candle flame was burning in air contaminated with fire damp, methane gas, the combustion of the gas took place around the base of the candle flame, not at the top. He therefore deduced that if the airflow past the flame could be increased, then the dangerous gas would not ignite. He developed a flue system which increased the gas flow over the flame. He tested it on the 21st of October 1815, and as he had reasoned, the gas did not explode. Instead, the flame went out. Within a month, he had improved the design to create a practical safety lamp. What George did not know was that Sir Humphrey Davy had been asked by the Society for Preventing Accident in Coal Mines to create a safety lamp. Davy published his intended design, not a working prototype, on the 9th of November 1815, some 3 weeks after George had first demonstrated his lamp. George was a respected engine-wright in the north-east coalfields, but Davy was a national celebrity, and he got the credit for this discovery, despite George beating him to the solution by a month. Davy was awarded a prize of £2,000, while George was accused of plagiarism. Eventually George proved his claim to have invented the first safety lamp, and was awarded £1,000 by the local mine owners. His lamp proved to be safer than Davy's, because his flame was behind a glass and would go out in the presence of fire damp, while Davy's was behind a wire gauze, which could heat up in the presence of fire damp, so had to be extinguished by the miner. This quarrel over the invention of the safety lamp implanted in George a deep distrust of London-based engineers and men of science, which he kept throughout his life. He also had a problem with brittle rails. Blucher, George's first travelling steam engine, was heavy, and it often broke the brittle cast-iron rails used to guide its flanged wheel. It also ran short of steam at times. George joined forces with a local chemist, William Losh, to develop a stronger cast-iron rail. Losh patented the new rail jointly with George, but George later decided that wrought-iron rails were stronger. To try and improve the steam-generating capacity of Blucher's boiler, George experimented with an idea he had picked up from Richard Trevithick, which was to vent the waste steam from the cylinders into the chimney to increase the draught on the fire. This did improve the steam generation, but with a simple kettle-type boiler used on Blucher, it also greatly increased the coal consumption, increased the noise level of the machine, and threw cinders from the fire out of the flue. The main limitation of George's early locomotives was the restrictive heating surface of the boiler, and it would take years to solve that problem. Nevertheless, Blucher performed consistently and reliably within its limits. Now we get to the subject of George's first full railway. With the combined success of his coal-transporting steam engine and his safety lamp, George was becoming a bit of a local celebrity, and Arthur Mowbray, the manager of a new Grand Allies colliery at Hetton in County Durham, approached him to supply a locomotive for a new railway which he wanted to build from Hetton down to the River Wear, some 8 miles away. George offered to subcontract the whole job, survey the line, lay the rails, build the engines, and supply the wagons. The line had to be able to be worked by both horses or locomotives, so the wheels had to be wide enough apart to allow a horse in shafts to fit between them. Thus was born the standard gauge of 4 feet 8 1/4 inches. It was on the Hetton line that George developed his project management skills. The line climbed 250 feet over a hill before gradually sloping down to the river. The finish line had 2 sections which were worked by locomotives, 3 by fixed cable engines and 5 by gravity-acting inclined planes. The Masonic gossip network also worked in George's favour by alerting brother Robert Stephenson, the famous lighthouse builder, about George's success. Robert Stephenson came to Killingworth in 1818 to meet George and view Blucher, noting afterwards, "Some of the most striking improvements of the system of railways are the patent inventions of Mr. Stephenson of Newcastle, in particular his locomotive engine." Now another Freemason enters George's life, brother William James. News of George's work on locomotives had spread to brother William James, who was a Birmingham land agent. He had seen brother Trevithick's locomotive demonstration in London and had a vision of how railways could become the basis of a national transport system. In 1821 he was interested in promoting a railway between the port of Liverpool and the cotton manufacturing town of Manchester. He visited Newcastle to see for himself how successful George's steam-powered colliery locomotives were. He was so impressed that he made a deal with George to promote the use of his locomotives in the many railways he was building support for. In the short term nothing came of this arrangement, but eventually it would prove to be the seed of George's most successful venture. By 1922 George had built 4 locomotives which were broadly similar in performance to the faithful old Blucher, and he had gained a solid reputation as a builder of colliery tramways. George was also fully committed to the benefits of education, and he was making enough money to send his son Robert to study engineering at Edinburgh University. There Robert won a prize for mathematics. Now we get to the Stockton and Darlington Railway. George had got wind of something of great import afoot some 45 miles south of Killingworth. Brother Edward Peace, a leading Quaker businessman and a member of Restoration Lodge 111, was promoting the idea of building a railway from the coalfields of Darlington to the dockside of Stockton. Pease had recently retired from his family's wool processing business and wanted to do something to improve the welfare of the Darlington district. During his travels as a wool merchant, he had come to the decision that a horse-drawn railway connecting the collieries of West Durham to the port of Stockton would benefit both towns. In 1821 he formed the Stockton and Darlington Railway Company to progress the idea, had a route surveyed, and then sought an Act of Parliament to approve the work. This Act provided for making and maintaining of tramways for the passage of wagons and carriages with men, horses, and otherwise. George travelled down to Darlington just before the Stockton and Darlington Act was due to receive royal assent. He walked the proposed line and then went to visit Edward Peace in his home. He took with him Nicholas Wood, the manager of the Killingworth pit, who had experience of Blucher's performance. Peace agreed to talk with them, and George managed to convince Peace that a locomotive, such as Blucher, could carry 50 times more weight than a horse could. Brother Robert Stephenson, the lighthouse builder, was Peace's consulting engineer for the line, and he had already endorsed George's locomotives. Brother Peace was convinced and offered George the role of chief engineer for the line. But George was fast becoming aware that his practical skills with railways and steam engines was a valuable commodity, and he wrote back saying, "I couldn't devote the whole of my time to your railway, but I shall be happy to if I can be of service in carrying out into execution your plans." This was a brave move on George's part, but when the deal was accepted, it set him up as an independent consultant engineer, not an employee of the railway company. With this prospect of using steam locomotives supplemented by stationary steam engines on inclines to run the Stockton and Darlington railway line, George realised that he couldn't build these machines in the workshops of the Grand Allies. He'd been allowed to use the workshops whilst constructing colliery locomotives for pits connected to the Grand Allies, but they had no interest in this new public railway. George suggested to Peace that they should set up a factory in Newcastle to build steam locomotives and winding engines. George had the £1,000 he had been given for inventing his safety lamp, but he needed more investment to set up the first locomotive production factory. He also wanted to establish his son Robert as a railway engineer, and so he proposed creating a partnership in 1823 to be called Robert Stephenson and Company. The partners were to be George and Robert Stephenson, Edward Peace, and local ironmaster Michael Longridge, with George contracted to oversee the running of the business. But to his son Robert it seemed he was being pressurised into taking on too much responsibility at a young age. Now we get to the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Soon after his meeting with George in 1821, William James had been employed to survey the route for a railway between Liverpool and Manchester, and had drawn the attention of Joseph Sanders of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Company to the success of Stephenson's steam locomotives. Unfortunately, Brother James overreached himself and went bankrupt in 1823. With James unavailable, Sanders visited George in Newcastle to see the part-completed Stockton and Darlington Railway. He was so impressed that he encouraged the London and Manchester to take on George as chief engineer. By now, George was stretching himself a little thinly over all the jobs he was doing. He was also commissioned to survey the Liverpool and Birmingham Railway, the London and Northern Line, and the London and South Wales Line. Nevertheless, he was offered the post of chief engineer on the Manchester by default, and tasked to create an accurate route survey and prepare the proposal for an Act of Parliament. He was paid £1,000 per annum. At the same time, Manchester dispensed with William James's service, as he was unavailable, being incarcerated in debtor's prison. The Stockton and Darlington line was not yet completed, and Edward Peace started to worry about the extent of George's overcommitment, and he was concerned about a possible conflict of interest when George was also approached by a company wishing to survey a line from Liverpool to Birmingham, a route which figured in the long-term plans of the Manchester Company. Now George set up the first independent railway consulting company. Peace encouraged George to create a rail surveying company to be called George Stephenson and Son, which had as its company objectives to survey and build railways. In this way, he encouraged George's educational intent to take on young men to train and employ in the new profession of mechanical engineering. Robert Stephenson had worked hard to set up the locomotive works in Newcastle, and was feeling the pressure of running the factory and helping his father with many surveys, which included him being seconded to William James for the first survey of the Liverpool and Manchester line. He felt under great pressure to carry out his father's wishes, but also wanted freedom to develop his own ideas. Thomas Richardson, Edward Peace's cousin, who had mining interests in South America, had noticed that Robert had become a competent all-round engineer, and asked him would he consider taking time out in Colombia to carry out surveys of potential mining sites. Robert liked the idea and asked William James for advice. James, who had 5 sons of his own, encouraged Robert to strike out on his own for a while and establish his own reputation. Taking this advice on board, Robert persuaded his partners, including his father, to give him leave of absence to undertake the work. His father arrived in Lancashire to begin work on the Liverpool and Manchester just in time to see Robert set off as he sailed from Liverpool on the Sir William Congreve, headed for South America. In this way, Robert avoided getting sucked into his father's overextended consulting and surveying company. George, however, wrote a clause into his company articles allowing Robert to take up his role within 3 months of his return to England, and he kept the name George Stephenson and Son. George now had a bad period. Robert's departure left George even more thinly spread than before, and Edward Peace was pushing him hard to spend time to make sure that the Stockton and Darlington line was a success, as well as calling in George's obligation to supervise the locomotive works, particularly now Robert was away. These responsibilities meant that George left most of the surveying work on the Liverpool and Manchester line to his young, inexperienced assistants. He also selected a route through the Chat Moss Bog, as this avoided many objections from landowners, since the moss was considered unusable. However, his assistants didn't do a good job, and George did not check their work. On the 25th of March, 1825, when he stood up in front of the Parliamentary Committee to defend the bill, the many mistakes in levels, headroom calculations and baseline measures were exposed. George himself was not a good speaker. He was poorly prepared to defend the route, and he had a broad Newcastle accent which the members of the Parliament found hard to understand. Edward Alderson, the lawyer representing the canal owners who opposed the line, exposed all the mistakes and made George look incompetent. Alderson closed his cross-examination, saying, "Did any ignorance ever arrive at such a pitch? I never knew a person so drawn on human credulity as Mr. Stephenson has proposed to do in the evidence he has given. I say he never had a plan. I do not believe he is capable of making one." George had set himself up as a civil engineer and had been publicly rubbished. The case for the Liverpool and Manchester line was badly damaged. His grand vision for George Stephenson and Son was dragged in the mud. George must have been glad that Robert was not there to see his humiliation when he was dismissed by the company. Brothers George and John Rennie were highly regarded civil engineers. They were the sons of brother John Rennie. They had built, among other things, the Lancaster Canal, the Crimmon Canal, the Rochdale Canal, and they were appointed in his place. They resurveyed George's choice of route, measured it more accurately, and persuaded Parliament to pass an act authorising it. While they were so engaged, George devoted all his energy to completing the Darlington line, and it was an instant success. Locomotion 1, supplied by Robert Stephenson and Co., and driven by George Stephenson, whose company, George Stephenson and Son, had built the line, was the star of the show. George's reputation as a practical engineer was restored. He was now reinstated to be the chief engineer of the Liverpool and Manchester line. Back in Liverpool, things weren't going so well. The Liverpool and Manchester board wanted one of the Rennie brothers to take on the role of chief engineer, but they couldn't agree terms. Joseph Sanders invited George back to build the line, provided he agreed to devote 9 months of his time every year to the job until it was completed. He was to be paid £1,000 per year. This condition was designed to stop George from overextending himself and make sure he did not repeat the mistake of not properly supervising his assistants. Most of the line was simple, but it posed 2 major challenges. A tunnel and a long, deep cutting was needed at the approach to Liverpool, and somehow the line had to be laid across 4 miles of bog, which was too weak to support a man walking across it. The Rennies and their colleague Charles Vignoles proposed to part drain the bog and build a viaduct to support the track. Their cost estimate for the work was £270,000. But George has noted something about the bog. He has seen how Mr. Roscoe, a local farmer, worked the bog with heavy draught horses by fitting flat wooden plates on their feet. The feet of the horse were a circle of about 5 inches in diameter. By extending the footprint to a diameter of 7 inches, the horse could walk normally on the bog surface. George was convinced that the best way to cross the Chat Moss was to spread its load over a wide area and distribute the pressure, in effect, to form a floating raft on top of the peat, which was to lay the railway track bed. The tunnel and cutting presented no problems for such an experienced mining engineer as George Stephenson. The work of dumping enough stuff, these were bundles of heather, bales of peat and wooden hurdles, into the bog took a long time, and the directors could see little progress for the increasing costs of transporting the material. George's local engineer, John Dixon, had to report both costs and line progress each week. For many weeks he reported growing costs without progress. When the directors questioned George, he said, "You must persevere. You must go on filling. The stuff emptied in is doing its work out of sight, and if you just have patience, it will soon begin to show." He was right. And 200 years later, the line still floats express trains over the quaking bog. Meanwhile, Robert was in America. He was finding he was not enjoying the survey work in Venezuela, and when he was invited to extend his contract, he declined and set off home. Whilst waiting for a ship at Carthagena, he met Brother Trevithick, who was stranded in the port, following the failure of a mining company which had employed him. Robert spent some time discussing ideas about steam engines, debating the ideas of multi-tube boilers and separate fireboxes with the older man. They probably also discussed the inspirational philosophy of Freemasonry, although Robert did not record any mention of it in his letters. But when he left for New York, he gave Brother Trevithick £50 to buy a passage home, and once in New York, he immediately sought out a lodge and asked to become a Mason. The Lodge of St. Andrew initiated him on the 21st of September, 1827, and he returned to England a full Master Mason. Before he came home, he made use of his new Masonic contacts to visit many interesting sites and inspect the steamboats which worked on the Hudson River and Lake Ontario. He returned just in time. Brother George had solved all the problems of laying the line, but he was losing the argument about the means of propulsion. The directors were thinking in terms of stationary winding engines and horse traction. George wanted to use locomotives. On the 29th of September, 1828, the directors dispatched Mr. Henry Booth, who was in favour of locomotives, and Mr. James Cropper, who supported stationary engines and cable traction, to look at the relative performance of winding engines, horse traction, and steam locomotives, all of which were in use on the Stockton and Darlington line. George was shocked when Booth's report favoured winding engines. He immediately responded with a damning report fully supported with facts, arguing against winding engines and pointing out that for the failure of a single engine or a single wagon derailment which would damage the cable stopped the whole line until it was repaired. The directors held a series of meetings to discuss the issue, commissioned further investigations, but being non-technical businessmen couldn't decide. They were also running short of money and had to apply to the government for a loan. Brother Thomas Telford, the great road and bridge builder, who had also experimented with the use of steam carriages on roads, was asked to inspect the completed works and report. He rode the whole of the line and walked the unfinished sections with George. Although Telford had some reservations about locomotives, which was hardly surprising following his poor experience of the reliability of his road-going steam carriage, he recommended the loan be advanced. He also endorsed George's view that it was possible to float the line of Chat Moss, having had experience of doing the same process a few years earlier to carry the A5 across Maltrive Marsh. However, he advised the directors to think carefully about the means of traction in light of both stationary and travelling steam engines having different issues of reliability. On the 20th of April, 1892, the directors decided to test the claims made by George for the increased reliability of steam locomotives by organising a competition with a prize of £500 for any manufacturer who could produce a steam locomotive to their published specification. Thus was born the famous Rainhill Trials. George entrusted the design of the Stephenson entry for the Rainhill Trials to his newly married son Robert, who had now settled back in Newcastle and taken over management of the 4th Street Locomotive Works. Robert brought together 4 distinct ideas in one engine for the first time. These were a blast pipe to speed the flue airflow and draw the fire, a separate firebox with a water preheater casing, a multi-tube boiler to increase the steam creation surface, and outside cylinders angled at 45 degrees and directly driving the traction wheels. This locomotive, the Rocket, was an outstanding success, being the only entry in the trials to fully meet the specification. It set the main parameters for steam engine design for the next 100 years, and showed that a locomotive could pull loads up gradients which had previously required the assistance of cable traction. 2 months later, George's prediction for the successful completion of his floating line across Chat Moss was confirmed, and Rocket pulled the first test train over the unpassable bog. The rest of this story is history. The Liverpool and Manchester line was an immediate financial success. George and Robert went on to become the most successful railway engineers of all time and helped build the national railway network. But there's another side of the work, which was inspired by the Masonic philosophy of the second degree, and that was to facilitate the study of the hidden mysteries and nature and science. Let's now look at the influence of Freemasonry on George's career. I have investigated Caroline Doherty's suggestion that Freemasonry might have provided a non-professional means of contact amongst engineers and their clients, and brought about a transfer and power and prestige between 2 groups, leading to the creation of a profession of engineering. I haven't managed to find a record of George Stephenson's initiation, but have discovered that he was buried with full Masonic honours, normally only accorded to a brother. What I have found is that a series of influential engineers, who also happened to be Freemasons, brethren Richard Trevithick, James Watt, and his Lewis son James Jr., brother Lord Strathmore, brother John Ford, brother Robert Stephenson, the lighthouse builder, brother Edward Peace, brother William James, and brother Thomas Telford, were all involved at key moments in George's career. Without the inspiration of brother Trevithick, George might never have become interested in and committed to the development of travelling steam engines. Without the helpful information of brother Lord Strathmore and brother James Watt, he would never have been invited to develop his project management skills in commissioning brother John Ford's successful steam-driven flax mill in Montrose. If brother Lord Strathmore had not given George the freedom to work as an independent freelance engine wright and supported the construction of Blucher, then George would never have developed the basic skills of locomotive manufacture or have been able to build his first colliery railway at Hetton. If brother Robert Stephenson, the lighthouse builder, had not endorsed George's locomotion, and brother Edward Peace had not listened to George's arguments in favour of using locomotives for the Stockton and Darlington line, and then trusted him to build the line, George would never have developed the skills needed to engineer public railways. Likewise, if brother Peace had not helped George to set up the 4th Street engine manufacturing works of Robert Stephenson and Company in Newcastle, then George would not have been able to develop his locomotive to the level where Rocket could win the Rainhill Trials. If brother William James had not offered to work with George to promote his locomotives, or had not introduced him to the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Company, then George would not have become the chief engineer to build the first Intercity railway. And finally, if brother Trevithick had not again met with Robert and shared with him ideas for improving steam generation in locomotives, and probably also told him about the inspirational philosophy of the second degree of Freemasonry, perhaps Robert would not have decided to seek initiation. Maybe this is just an unlikely chain of coincidences, but the key step in George's fortunes came when he went to Montrose. I believe that is where he was introduced to the educational philosophy of Freemasonry and encouraged to study the hidden mysteries of nature and science to better understand the world. George devoted the rest of his life to this study, and took his responsibilities to educate the next generation extremely seriously, first by taking apprentices and later by becoming the first president of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. I have only circumstantial evidence for the time and place of George's initiation, but strong evidence that he was buried with Masonic honours. There is not much evidence of George taking part in English Lodge meetings, but in those days of great secrecy, men did not discuss their membership of Freemasonry. However, many of the fathers of public engineering were Freemasons and formed a charmed circle. Just look at the list of fully attested Masons: Brother John Rennie and his 2 sons, Brother James Brindley, Brother James Watt and his sons, Brother Robert Stephenson, the lighthouse builder, and his sons, and Brother Thomas Telford. George's son, Brother Robert Stephenson's full acceptance into this special group was signalled when he succeeded Brother Thomas Telford as the president of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and I think we should thank Brother Trevethick for influencing Robert Stephenson to join Freemasonry in New York, helping him gain access to the US steam engineering innovators who welcomed him to inspect their work soon after he was initiated. These experiences were essential to developing the ideas embodied in the rocket. In true Masonic teaching spirit, Brother Thomas Telford set up the Institution of Civil Engineers to instruct young would-be engineers in the hidden mysteries of nature and science, and their application to works of civil engineering. By this act he created the profession of civil engineering. But Brother George Stephenson in his turn set up the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, driven by the same motives, and so established the new profession of mechanical engineering, which used its mathematical and practical skills to revolutionize travel and facilitate the economic success of the Industrial Revolution. But that's another story for another time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please click the subscribe box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen.